Well, Jasmine Pickel, this is a first meet for us, but it's not a first meet to our viewers of your organization, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, doing phenomenal work.
Thank you.
In tracking on this whole issue of how our government stewards our money, our public funds. So how did you get involved in this work, and why is this a passion of yours personally?
So I've always been a big fan of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation because for a number of years, since my early 20s, I had after I was done school, I started a business, and I really worked hard to continue to grow it, hire new people, and I just felt as if the government at every turn was taxing me and making it more difficult for me to continue to grow my business and hire young Canadians. So it's really important to have an organization like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and they're few and far between in Canada. The CTF really does stand out as one of the strongest voices and advocates for lower taxes in this country.
Now, for those that maybe have never heard of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, just give a quick crash course on what exactly you guys do.
Absolutely. So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is a nonprofit. We're totally funded by voluntary donations, a nonpartisan group that advocates for lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government.
Okay, there you go, bottom line. So give us a bit of a crash course as well on where Canada is at, particularly in the last few years, what we've done in the last few years in the area of taxing Canadians.
Yeah, so it's been positive news insofar as a lot of Canadians thought that as soon as Justin Trudeau got in, he was going to hike taxes and life was going to become a lot more expensive. So the good news is that that really didn't come to fruition. But the bad news is that if you're already feeling the pinch right now, things are not going to get easier anytime soon. The Fraser Institute recently put out a study that suggested that Trudeau's tax changes would increase the cost of living by about $2,200 for the average Canadian family.
Per year?
Yes. So a lot of those changes came from he increased the CPP, the amount that we pay on our at the point of payroll, and also our employers match it as well. He increased that by 0.15%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but on average that's costing each Canadian about $100 a year. And it's also indexed to go up every year for the next 5 years. So in 5 years' time, we will be spending about $550 extra a year on that. So it can be quite expensive for any Canadian who's already feeling, that pinch between paychecks.
Now, and there was a study that came out that said most Canadians are only $200 away from not being able to pay the bills. So talk about that for a moment.
So, when they have these small changes like to the CPP or canceling various tax credits that were Harper era, they were introduced under Stephen Harper, such as the textbook, credit for students, fitness, transport, these boutique tax credits. Also, income splitting for families was a big one. When those are canceled, that can really be the difference between, making things meet at the end of the month or not.
Right, it's huge. Now, what are some of the other tax changes that have happened over the last few years that have caught your attention?
So the biggest would be the carbon tax, and we hear a lot about the carbon tax from our supporters. So I would say that the carbon tax has been sold to Canadians as, really just affecting the big emitters, but at the end of the day, it's average Canadians that are paying the bills for this. So when you think of seniors who are on fixed incomes or other low-income Canadians, that when they go to the grocery store, now the price of all essentials, grocery items, fruit, healthy, vegetables, all of that goes up because everything at the grocery store is transported, on our roads. So that takes fuel to get there. And at the end of the, when they're paying for their groceries, it's not about buying a more tax or fuel efficient car. This can, hit you in the grocery lineup. So it really is quite a bit more expensive with the carbon tax.
And from an environmental perspective, do you feel like it's a winning policy? Is this actually going to help the environment in the way that Trudeau's hoping for?
Sadly, I wish it would. If it did, I would, maybe feel differently about it. But the reality is that when you're taxing essential items like groceries, people don't have a choice. They need to eat. They need to buy those items. Also, on the grand scheme of things, Canada emits something like 1.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So even if we were to completely go carbon neutral, which is not our target, that would be less than a drop in the bucket in terms of global emissions. When you've got, the United States is a massive emitter in comparison to Canada, has not signed on to the Paris agreements. India, China as well continue to see emissions go up. So it's not that Canada should do nothing, but there are other ways to reduce our carbon footprint that aren't going to hurt vulnerable Canadians.
Wow. Now let's talk about the tax on the tax.
Absolutely. So you know that I'm very passionate about this issue. So Canadians already pay a lot of tax. In fact, around this time is Tax Freedom Day. So Tax Freedom Day represents the day that the average Canadian finally has reached the point that they've stopped paying all of their money to the government in taxes, and then they can start keeping the money that they earn. So
about the middle of the year.
Yes, this year it fell on June 14th. So up until June 13th, the average Canadian, everything that they had earned from January 1st until June 13th had all gone to the government in forms of taxes. So 3 different levels of government.
Okay, can you say that again?
So on average, 45% of each family's income goes to the government at 3 different levels, so federal, provincial, and municipal. 45% of family income goes to pay tax.
Okay, January 1st to June 14th in 2019.
Yes.
100% of that going to pay taxes and government fees.
Yes. So you're being taxed at all turns. And the tax on tax issue is that when you get your income, you pay tax on that in various forms, payroll taxes, but predominantly income tax. And then in addition to that, when you go, for example, to the pumps, you're paying up to 6 different types of taxes. So a lot of people think, if I'm paying $100 to fill my tank, that's all just for the price of gas. But actually, something like 66% of that is just for gas, but then the remaining 34% is up to 6 different taxes.
Wow, so enlightening. Wow, Jasmine, you've given us enough to think about right there. Now, we're going to throw to a clip here in a moment from the House of Commons of our leaders going at it, right? Because this is definitely one of the hot potatoes. It's one of the things that's going to be front and center as we go to the polls in October. So we're going to watch this clip in a moment, and then I'd love to pick up the conversation right after this.
MNP, the accounting firm, reports that almost half of Canadians are less than $200 away from insolvency every month.
That's right.
And in April, over 11,000 Canadians did go insolvent, a 9% annual increase over the previous year. Wow. When will this government realize that Canadians are taxed to the max and can't afford to pay any more?
The fact of the matter is 9 million middle-class Canadians have lower taxes because we lowered the tax bracket between $45,000 and $90,000 by 7%. Mr. Speaker, we added on the Canada Child Benefit, making sure that 9 out of 10 families are better off. So the facts are clear.
Well, this minister doesn't think anybody who takes the bus is middle class, so he raised their taxes by taking away their transit tax. He doesn't think that soccer moms and hockey dads are middle class, so he took away their children's fitness tax credit. He doesn't think students are middle class, so he took away the education and textbook tax credits. That doesn't even include the carbon and payroll tax increases. But what's worse is what's to come. This government is spending at an unsustainable rate, requiring higher taxes if they're re-elected. Why won't they tell the truth about the higher costs that Canadians will pay when the Liberals no longer need their votes but still need their money?
We were able to manage to lower taxes on Canadians even with the $150 billion of additional debt left to us by the previous government. So the Liberal approach is helping Canadians, not just the friends of Conservatives.
People who take the bus, people who put their kids in sports, students who go to university and college, I'm happy to call those people Conservative friends. They have no friends on that side of the House because these Liberals will continue to raise taxes on middle-class Canadians, another $23 billion spending increase and a promise-breaking deficit to go along with it. Why don't they just admit that after the election, if God forbid they're back, there will be massive tax increases to pay for all of this out-of-control spending?
This
This Prime Minister has no understanding and no respect for hardworking middle-class Canadians. He thinks that small business owners are tax cheats. He thinks construction workers are a threat to our rural communities, and he calls commuters who are driving to work polluters. He's made it more expensive to access public transit, to buy textbooks, or to put their kids in sports. But to add insult to injury, these are the very people who are going to be paying more at for gas at the pump. So why is the Prime Minister making life so expensive for everyday middle-class Canadians? He does absolutely nothing while small business owners are dealing with the price of his carbon tax. Canadian families are falling further and further behind under the weight of his failed economic policies, and they're asking for tax breaks.
This is why we have lowered the small business tax rate to 9%, making it one of the lowest. We're helping hardworking Canadians create those jobs in small businesses. We're helping small businesses be more competitive. We've cut more regulations in the 3.5 years we've been government than you did than the Conservatives did in the last 10 years. Mr. Speaker, we're working hard for Canadians.
Okay. Well, there you have it. Those were the main talking points as the House of Commons began to close. Now we're heading towards an election. What are your thoughts on what you just saw there?
So it is true that Trudeau's government lowered taxes for one income tax bracket, which was the second from the bottom. But certainly the middle class could be considered to be much broader than that. And what's worrisome is that they are raising rates in the other brackets, the higher brackets. So it's a common misconception that raising tax rates will increase government revenues. There are theories such as the Laffer curve, for example, that will show that sometimes lowering tax rates can actually increase tax revenues. So it's worrisome that when he's targeting higher income families in this country, that he might actually drive them away, and we might lose that tax revenue as a result. So it's a bit of a dicey game. So he did reduce that one bracket, but not all of them. He's raising them, which is worrisome. In addition, he's introducing a lot of new taxes, which we find very, very disturbing. So there was talk about a sugar tax, which would impact a lot of the food we eat, as there's sugar in a lot of it. Could be very, very damaging, especially to northern communities that rely on some of those foods as non-perishables.
So that would be things like, that was a soda pop tax, right?
Just a sugar tax generally.
Okay.
And so that tried to kind of be hidden a little bit before, not hidden, but just buried, I would say, in government documentation prior to the election. Fortunately, my colleague in Ottawa saved a copy of the document that we found announcing that, the government was considering this sugar tax. There's a number of other taxes being considered as well. So it's very worrisome that this government, the plastic tax, for example, it's very worrisome that this government is just spending so much time dreaming up new ways to tax Canadians. And lastly, to respond to the statement they made about small businesses, I was running a small business, which I later sold in an acquisition deal, which is why I'm thankfully with Taxpayers as well. But I was running a small business at the time in 2017 when they were considering tax changes for small business owners. And it was around this time that provincially, Kathleen Wynne had just spent $200,000 on renting a plastic duck to float around Lake Ontario. And shortly after in that year, Justin Trudeau had spent, I think, close to $5 million or potentially more on putting an ice rink on Parliament Hill, which was next to the Rideau Canal, the longest, skating rink. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it was very, very difficult when I'm struggling as a small business owner to grow my business and make ends meet when the government is wasting so many tax dollars so frivolously. So it was very, very difficult to watch. And so I'm glad to see that Trudeau and Morneau had backed down from those tax changes they wanted to make for small businesses, but they only did so after a really, really large and loud outcry.
Okay, so we're talking a lot about taxes here, but the taxes you said for that one income bracket went down, but the federal debt and the deficit, right? Way bigger than anybody expected. As we head towards a federal election and candidates are knocking on people's doors, what are some of the things that you're advising that Canadians should be speaking to our leaders about going into this election? So
I'm glad you asked that question, because we were I wish we weren't surprised. We weren't surprised to see that, sadly, Trudeau broke his promise in 2015, 4 years ago in the same scenario in election time. He had promised very resolutely to balance the budget. And now we see this year he's continuing to add billions of dollars in deficit spending, which is all debt that gets piled on and that we end up paying for. So what Canadians, and especially those in Ontario, which is the largest subnational debtor on the planet, what we need to keep in mind is that debt today is taxes tomorrow, and it's immoral, we believe, to pass on today's spending to future generations. So just as an example, currently in Ontario, which as I mentioned has a huge debt, over I think 360 billion, it's very, very large. Every hour, so probably the length of this program, we spend $1.5 million just in interest on that debt. So it's very, very troubling that, as Ontarians think we need more frontline services, we need maybe more teachers, more hospitals, we're spending our budgetary line item for the interest that we spend on our debt is massive, very high up there, and could be going towards some of these really important services that we need. So I would really hope that everyone watching this program has that, the reckless spending of government on their mind. We don't just need to balance our budgets, we need to start paying off some of this debt. I mean, Canadians do that. Nobody would rack up debt at their own household and not worry about it. So we should hold our government to the same account.
Now, what would you say to people that are concerned about spending cuts because of cuts perhaps to the poor and people in need? That seems to be a regular argument.
Yes. So I think that they should they should challenge their governments, because their governments are similarly spending a lot of money on non-essential services. For example, there are so many, how can I think of one? There are so many examples where government is spending on, people to go count calories on menus at restaurants, but they're cutting frontline services. And I hate to be very skeptical here, but I do think that sometimes governments are more inclined to cut where people are going to feel it so that the public outcry will be much louder. But there are so many examples of waste that if these governments were just able to tighten their belts and cut some of the waste, we have a massive federal budget every year, something over $300 billion we spend every year federally. And so if the government wants to say there's no room for savings there, I don't believe it, and Canadians shouldn't either.
Wow. Now, you guys are regularly communicating not only with our leaders, but with Canadians. You have articles that you're putting out on a regular basis. What are some of the resources that your organization provides for us?
Great. So we love coming on shows like this, so thank you for having us. We do op-eds. We're writing regularly to newspapers. It would be great, actually, as well, if anyone's interested in following the work that we're doing regularly, because we're often running petitions and doing some very effective work fighting on behalf of Canadians for lower taxes. To follow us online, we have social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Follow us there. Taxpayer.com is our website, and we're often uploading our petitions there as well if they're interested to go on and sign.
Wow. Okay. Last 30 seconds. Admonition to Canadians out there about what our leaders need to do.
I would say, first and foremost, they need to recognize that Canadians are pinched, taxes are high. Like I said earlier, the average family, it's 45% of their income is going toward taxes, which on average is $53,000 per family. And that's a lot of money that could, likewise be spent potentially better on their own, toward their own charitable causes, toward things that are near and dear to their hearts. So taxes need to be lower. Canadians are really feeling it, and we need to take care of this debt problem. Governments need to stop spending so recklessly.
Wow, well put. Jasmine, thank you so much for being with us today. We'll be watching you as we head towards the polls on the 21st of October.
Thank you.